On January 12th of this year, longtime Tower of Power drummer David Garibaldi announced that his time in the band had come to an end. This marked the finale in a chapter of music history that was both a unique and an influential one. In addition to being a member of the Tower of Power for much of the time between July of 1970 and December of 2023, his talents can be found on recordings by the likes of Gino Vannelli, Deneice Williams, and Natalie Cole, or providing drum set parts for soundtracks to movies such as Star Trek IV. His instructional materials have inspired many, and his private students have included the likes of Matt Chamberlain, who you may know from Fiona Apple, Adele, or Pearl Jam, or Doug Clifford, who provided that world-famous backbeat for Creedence Clearwater Revival. Tower of Power formed in 1968 in Oakland, California, and they quickly caught the attention of legendary promoter Bill Graham, who signed them to San Francisco Records. In 1970, they recorded East Bay Grease, which would be their first and only album with Graham's label. In 1972, the band signed a 6-album deal with Warner Brothers Records, and it was at that time that Garibaldi made the conscious decision to focus on creating different beats and different rhythmic combinations for each song on each album. He pointed out in a 2019 Drum Channel Roundtable, "I can't do the same thing for 6 more albums." This choice to make creativity one of the pillars of his personalized sound would result in some of the most unique drum parts ever crafted in the genres of funk, soul, or R&B. Together with organist Chester Thompson, the late guitarist Bruce Conte, and late bassist Francis Rocco Prestia, David Garibaldi would forge a new sound that combined elements of Latin, gospel, blues, and funk into what would become the hallmark sound of the Tower of Power rhythm section between early 1973 and late 1975. It was a rhythm section that truly sounded like no other, and even to this day, when you put on a TOP recording from that period of time, you know it's them. Hi, I'm Brian Humphreys, and the subject of this video will focus on Squib Cakes, an instrumental song from the Tower of Power's 1974 release, Back to Oakland. More specifically, I will examine and demonstrate a portion of the drum set part to a particular organ solo that will also include the guitar and organ parts. Squib Cakes served as a vehicle through which David Garibaldi would demonstrate his cutting-edge creativity. The version of Squib Cakes I've chosen is from a 1974 radio broadcast that I'll get back to discussing a little bit later in this video. Although its quirky title may not be familiar to most, it's possible that you've heard its signature drum beat that Garibaldi crafted because it was used as the foundation to the song Release It, which appeared on Prince's soundtrack to the movie Graffiti Bridge in 1990. Morris Day, band leader of the time, a drummer in his own right who provided the vocal part on Release It, said in a December 2022 interview for Tidal, "Now mind you, I've always been a big Tower of Power fan. When Lenny Williams got in the band, to me, Back to Oakland and all that stuff was just some of the greatest music I thought I'd ever heard. And Dave Garibaldi, the drummer, was always my favorite, or at least one of my favorites." It helps to be familiar with a little bit of the history leading up to what Squib Cakes would become. Composer and organist Chester Thompson, who would go on to hold the keyboard chair in Carlos Santana's band from 1983 to 2009, was well-versed in gospel music and the jazz stylings of Hammond organ pioneer Jimmy Smith. He could simultaneously play bass lines, chords, and melodies on the organ, just as his mentors had. In early 1973, as the band was recording their 3rd studio album, and knowing that they were on the lookout for a keyboard player, Conte and Garibaldi approached Thompson about playing in the band. Soon after that meeting, Thompson would come to the recording studio to lay down some organ tracks on what would become the single, What Is Hip? Although Thompson impressed bandleader Emilio Castillo and was ultimately offered the position in the band if he wanted it, according to a 2022 interview with Bruce Conte, he initially considered declining the invitation to join the Tower of Power because he was accustomed to filling the roles of both keyboardist and bass player. Thompson would join the band and ultimately, as we'll see, would come to play the bass pedals at specific points throughout the Tower of Power show. Over the course of the band's next 3 albums, Thompson would compose instrumental songs in which each soloist had what he referred to as an aura. In the case of Squib Cakes, Thompson's aura would be rooted in what jazz enthusiasts know as the classic instrumental trio of organ, drums, and guitar. Central to the sound of this organ trio were Thompson's use of the bass pedals and of the many combinations of tones and sounds that he would get from the Hammond B3 organ. By late 1973, the new lineup that included Thompson and Conte, as well as saxophonist Lenny Pickett and lead vocalist Lenny Williams, had developed a set list of songs that included the new instrumental, Squib Cakes. Instrumentals provided their audiences with an opportunity to experience the versatility and virtuosity of individual band members. Instrumentals like Squib Cakes, Walkin' Up Hip Street, and Ebony Jam would typically feature 4 soloists, the last often being Thompson. At key points throughout their show, the trio combination of Thompson, Conte, and Garibaldi would emerge from the Tower of Power's 11-member sound. This band within a band would function as a vehicle for both Thompson and Garibaldi to showcase their talents and abilities both as creators of unique musical accompaniments and as improvisers. The resulting sound could be likened in some ways to the effect produced by John Coltrane's famous quartet, when pianist McCoy Tyner and bassist Jimmy Garrison would drop out just as the music seemed to be reaching its most intense point, leaving only saxophonist Coltrane and his drummer Alvin Jones to interweave their musical phrases, all the while maintaining a feeling of intensity and great anticipation for the listener. Moving forward to 1974, the band was touring on their most recent release, Back to Oakland, and by that time, that particular lineup had been touring for almost a year. In a 1991 interview for Modern Drummer magazine, Garibaldi recalled, "We used to rehearse constantly. If we weren't rehearsing, we were writing, or we were talking about it. And if we weren't doing any of those things, we were doing gigs. It was 7 days a week, like a steamroller." The level of cohesiveness, of understanding, familiarity, and of trust was at an all-time high in the Tower of Power. They ultimately set the standard by which Dave Garibaldi would compare all other bands and ensembles that he would play in the future. In that same Modern Drummer magazine article, he recalled how unfavorably the horn section reacted when they found out that he'd been playing the introduction to a song in their set list called Knock Yourself Out in phrases of 7/8 notes against their 4/4 time. This would, in a way, foreshadow some of the drum parts that he would craft not only for future studio albums, but also incorporate into the live performance setting. Being unusually technical was not common in those drumming styles back at that time. There are, of course, exceptions. Gregg Erico from Sly and the Family Stone, Mike Clark from Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, Michael Shreive with Santana, Gaylord Birch with Cold Blood, or the Pointer Sisters. All of these players were pushing the boundaries of what was possible in funk, soul, and R&B at the time. There are many examples of Garibaldi's, and Thompson's for that matter, contributions to each Tower of Power song that they recorded. And there are a variety of approaches that Garibaldi took to avoiding repeating himself and ultimately to sound consistently fresh from one song to the next. With precisely executed dynamic levels, and what I prefer to refer to as beat displacements, his approach was on par with the most innovative players in music of that day, regardless of genre or style. As a young student, I recall learning a technique that was common among jazz players that involved creating musical phrases that somehow seemed completely random, to play groups of notes in phrases of 3 beats over bars that are written in 4 beats. Around that same time, I discovered this while transcribing the drum part that David played to the organ solo in a song called Ebony Jam from the 1975 release In the Slot. This is what musicians might refer to as playing musical phrases of 7/8 superimposed over a time signature of 4/4. In Squib Cakes, Thompson based the melody's main rhythmic figure on what he referred to as the spangalang pattern. This was typically played by jazz drummers on the ride cymbal. In theoretical terms, this rhythm is often referred to as a dotted eighth sixteenth, or more elaborately, you might say a quarter note followed by a dotted eighth sixteenth, followed by another quarter note, to give you this kind of a rhythm. Combined with a spangalang-like melody and bass pedal accompaniment, his gospel-infused chord voicings provided a canvas upon which Garibaldi would craft some of the most innovative and exciting drum intros ever heard up to that point in R&B, gospel, and funk music. He would also cleverly weave his ideas in and around Thompson's bass lines, chord progressions, and solo melodies at a technical level that had rarely been seen in that style of music up to that point. From the 2013 release Hipper Than Hip, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, the performance of Squib Cakes demonstrates a method that Garibaldi used to create a uniquely contemporary sound, as that band within a band neared the end of Chester Thompson's organ solo. His choice of harmonic rhythm in this case was often doubled by Conte's strumming patterns, although they were mindful to find brief openings where the other wasn't playing. In this specific example, both Thompson and Conte would play two-bar rhythmic phrases that were vaguely reminiscent of Phelps Collins' rhythm guitar part in the hit single for James Brown, Soul Power. In isolation, their parts wouldn't stand out as being anything unique for that time period of music. It was the drum part that cleverly interlaced itself with the organ and guitar parts that seemed to create this random combination of bass drum, snare drum, ride cymbal, and hi-hat that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a drum part that was short by half a beat compared to the phrases that Bruce and Chester were playing. And if you survived your fraction lessons from back in the day, you might recall that 7/8 do not equal 4/4, and therefore don't line up on the musical grid. Upon first listening, the resulting effect seems somewhat arbitrary, a kind of musical bobbing and weaving, when in fact what the listener is hearing is a really well-crafted and well-executed form of musical expression on the drum set that is as fresh and exciting today as it was 50 years ago. Okay, so let's pick things up 2 bars before the 7/8 note groupings begin. I've included links to my resources down in the show notes. Thank you to the Tower of Power for many years of inspiring music. Special thanks to David Garibaldi for your artistry. And an extra special thanks to Emilio Castillo for encouraging the creativity, not only of David, but Chester, Bruce, Rocco, Gregg, the Lennys, etc., etc. And thank you to you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.